Jonathan Wilkinson is Canada's Minister of Fisheries. He joins me now from the foyer of the House of Commons this evening. Minister Wilkinson, good to see you again. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
What's the message you see for Canada in this report from the United Nations?
Well, it's a pretty scary report, and it's consistent with the World Wildlife Fund report that came out some time ago, which shows a very significant decline in biodiversity around the planet. It is mirrored by the decline of biodiversity that we are seeing in Canada. As you know, we have over 500 listed species under the Species at Risk Act in Canada. And I think it's an urgent call to action that we need to be doing more to ensure that we are protecting wild spaces, protecting animals, protecting plants, to ensure that we have a healthy ecosystem, because ultimately human beings rely on healthy ecosystems to continue to be healthy themselves.
Do you think that enough people spend enough time making that link? It seems to me a lot of the discussion has gone on sort of on two streams. What's happening in ecosystems doesn't affect what I might do sitting in my backyard tonight. Do you think enough people understand that link?
I think increasingly people are understanding it, although certainly there needs to be more conversation, and I think this report is a very helpful addition to that conversation. But certainly in British Columbia, for example, the decline of wild salmon populations certainly has a very direct impact on people, and I think that increasingly people are seeing that the decline of biodiversity is something that does affect them, and that there are things that we can do to address and stem this decline. Things like fighting climate change, ensuring that all political parties in Canada have a credible climate plan, ensuring that we're thinking about how we protect habitat, whether that's in the water or it's on land, to ensure that these species actually have places where they can live and thrive. Those are critical issues, and I think that people are becoming ever more aware.
It may be the most dire I think nature warning that I've seen in some times, but it's not like we haven't had these warnings before. We've had them for years. And instead of improvements in the situation, we've seen a deterioration of the situation. Why is that happening?
Well, I think it's happening for a couple of reasons. I do think it's to what you said before. I think it needs to become more of our public discourse in the same way that climate change and addressing climate change, I think, has become far more mainstream in the discourse that we are having as Canadians and as citizens of the planet. I think it also takes political will. It's not easy to do things that are required to address the decline of biodiversity. You know, we are the first government to take actual and very robust steps to fully implement the Species at Risk Act. We did that with the Western chorus frog decision in Quebec. We are doing that with boreal and South Mountain caribou across the country. We've done it with the South Resident killer whale, with the North Atlantic right whale, with the St. Lawrence estuary belugas. We're doing it now with salmon on the West Coast. I mean, this government has taken the biodiversity decline very seriously. We think it's an urgent problem, and it does require political will.
You have a long history in the sort of green energy sector. The report suggests that it's up to governments, you've touched on that, to spur the kind of change that's needed. And it mentions the need to eliminate subsidies, for instance, to industries that feed unsustainable habits, and it talks about fossil fuel subsidies among them. Your government promised to eliminate those. When will that happen?
We are working on the elimination of fossil fuel subsidies. We've made international commitments with our G20 partners. We have commenced a lot of that activity and that work, and we are committed to meeting our international obligations, which is to phase out fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. But I would say that in terms of sustainable practices, it's not just the oil and gas industry. I mean, we need to ensure that we are doing sustainable forestry. That is the biggest threat that exists to the survival of South Mountain and boreal caribou and many of the species that live in our forests.
And sustainable fishing.
And sustainable fishing. We need to ensure that we are, fishing sustainably. And, as you probably have heard, I brought in restrictions with respect to fishing of Chinook salmon, Fraser River Chinook salmon, a couple of weeks ago, precisely for that reason, because we need to turn around the decline such that we are not driving these species into extinction.
Let's follow that. The report does warn of massive overfishing in many sectors, pushing some stocks ever closer to extinction. Can we sustain the fisheries in this country without looking at, again, back to subsidies, eliminating subsidies? For instance, employment insurance. We have that debate in this country. It's very polarizing, we know that. But it does allow many Canadians to fish seasonally, but make essentially a full-time living at it. Is that a conversation we need to have as a country that says, look, we can't continue to subsidize this because it's not good for the stocks?
Well, the biodiversity conversation about fisheries is really about how you're managing them and what is the total allowable catch that you're actually allowing, if any, depending on the species. How is it actually allocated? And what factors are you taking into account when you're setting the total allowable catch from year to year? One of the big factors that we now have to grapple with every year that we did not have to do 10 or 20 years ago is the impact of climate change. When the water temperatures are warming, it has significant impacts on the ecosystems, and it has significant impacts on what fish exist there and how abundant they are. And so those are definitely things that my department is looking at in terms of how do we incorporate those things. But it is incumbent on us to ensure that we are allowing the fishery to exist and ensuring that jobs and economic opportunity exist, but only to the point where you can manage that in a sustainable way. The whole framework of sustainability, whether it's fisheries or anything else, needs to inform public policy on a go-forward basis. We cannot continue to do things the way we have been doing them for the past number of decades.
Does that suggest that it is impossible to think that the size of the fishing industry in this country, given the challenges that this report suggests we're facing, would not shrink? Is that a guarantee that it can't stay the size it is when we face these kinds of stock challenges?
Well, I think what the report actually talked about was about a third of global fish stocks are overfished.
Right.
That is actually mainly...
I think only 7% underfished, so
yeah.
That's a big imbalance.
But that is mainly in other areas of the world, and it relates in part to things like illegal, unregulated fishing, which is something Canada actually raised as a big topic during our presidency of the G7, where people are coming into countries and waters and essentially scooping up huge amounts of fish that you then don't know how much have been taken, and makes it much more difficult for countries that are good actors to manage their fishery. So we need to do stuff that addresses those issues, that shuts down illegal fishing. But within Canadian waters, we actually do manage towards sustainability. We need to be more thoughtful about how we are actually incorporating climate change. It may mean that some stocks will be reduced in terms of the take, but others may go up. I mean, you know, you're seeing an abundance, for example, on the East Coast in lobster, as you see declines in other species. The trick is to ensure that you're managing sustainably and that you're incorporating the various variables, and particularly now climate change, into the forecasts that you're using on which to make those decisions.
Right. Let me finish on this. Do we require in this country a reframing of the conversation and a reframing of the debate? It always seems that people will see a report like this, and then what it always comes down to is, okay, it's now again this battle. Because if you look at the report, it's all about expanding the conversion of land for development and so on, and all of that is directly connected, obviously, to the economy. But it's reframing the debate about, what has to be done for sustainability, and you get the answer, well, not if it's going to hold back the economy. And, we need to reframe that conversation.
We absolutely need to reframe that conversation. You cannot, in the long term, have a healthy economy if you do not have a healthy environment. And I think that's exactly what the United Nations report is saying. We need to ensure that we are talking about that we are bringing Canadians along with us in the conversation that says protecting the environment is also about protecting the economy. I would tell you, young people get this already. You talk to young people, I go to universities, I go to high schools, I go to elementary schools. They care most about protecting our natural world. They care most about addressing the issues of climate change. They get it, and we need to ensure that that is something that is transmitted across generations, because it is a time where we have the opportunity to grab these issues and to address them in a fundamental way, but we don't have a lot of time to do that.
All right, Jonathan Wilkinson, Canada's Minister of Fisheries and Oceans. Good to speak to you. Thanks for making time.
Thank you.